All right, welcome to this explainer. Back in March 2023, Apple did something pretty shocking. They quietly pulled the plug on their absolute most powerful, most expensive desktop computer. It literally just vanished from their website, and they confirmed they have no plans to ever build another one. Now, if you just use a computer to check your email or stream videos, you probably didn't even notice. But for elite power users, this was the end of a massive computing era, one that actually kicked off way back in 1994 with the original Power Mac. So it really begs the question, why? Why on earth would Apple completely abandon a machine built specifically for the most demanding, highest paying professionals in their entire ecosystem? I mean, we're talking about a machine that, if you fully maxed out the specs, could easily cost more than a decent used car. To understand why the Mac Pro had to die, we actually have to rewind the clock a bit and look at how professional computing was defined in the very beginning. To get a sense of this, let's picture the 90s and 2000s. Back then, the absolute gold standard for a pro workstation was the Mini Tower. And a Mini Tower wasn't trying to look super sleek or thin on your desk. It was all about massive internal space. For power users, that empty space inside the case was quite literally everything. It meant you had room to slot in extra hard drives, pack in way more RAM, and swap out for the newest graphics cards. It was entirely modular. If a part broke or if it just got outdated, you didn't throw the whole computer away. You just swapped out the piece. Plus, all that space meant fantastic airflow, which kept the components nice and cool. Buying a Mini Tower was basically the ultimate way to future-proof your investment. But there was a major villain lurking in the background of this era, and it was known as the thermal wall. See, as Apple kept pushing and pushing for more raw processing power, these internal components started generating insane amounts of excess heat. And heat is the ultimate enemy of a processor. When a chip gets too hot, it deliberately throttles, it slows itself down to avoid actually melting itself. Apple learned this the hard way, for sure. Back in 2000, they tried this totally silent, fanless design with the G4 Cube, and its performance absolutely tanked because of those thermal constraints. By the time the Power Mac G5 rolled around in 2003, they were so desperate to keep the processors cool that the machine needed 9 individual fans and, which was wild for the time, a literal liquid cooling system just to stop it from throttling. They had hit a literal physical wall. By 2005, Steve Jobs realized that endlessly chasing this raw, blazing hot power was just a losing game. The metric that actually mattered wasn't just power, it was performance per watt. He famously pointed out that their old PowerPC architecture gave them about 15 units of performance per watt, whereas the upcoming roadmap from Intel was promising around 70. That realization triggered the massive transition to Intel processors. When the original Intel Mac Pro dropped in 2006, it absolutely shattered benchmarks. It ran cooler, and it gave professionals exactly what they'd been craving. You could easily argue that 2006 was peak Mac Pro. Which brings us to Section 1, the post-PC distraction. Now, the financial numbers during this era, they are just staggering. Check this out. In 2007, when the very first iPhone launched, it made up a tiny 0.5% of Apple's total revenue, while Mac sales were the overwhelming majority. Just 2 short years later, in 2009, the iPhone had skyrocketed to 30.5%, practically tying the Mac at 32.4%. The shift was so drastic that Apple even officially dropped the word computer from their company name. The sheer speed at which mobile devices caught up to desktop computing completely rewired Apple's internal priorities. So all those longtime Mac Pro users, who were totally used to being the absolute center of Apple's universe, suddenly felt entirely ignored as hardware updates slowed to an absolute crawl. Steve Jobs actually hit the nail on the head with a famous analogy back in 2010. He compared computers to trucks. He said, when everyone lived on a farm, everyone needed a heavy-duty truck. But as people moved to cities, they wanted cars with power steering and automatic transmissions. Things you wouldn't necessarily care about if you were driving a tractor. In this scenario, the iPhone and the newly introduced iPad were the cars. They were lightweight, accessible, and incredibly easy to use. The Mac Pro, that was the heavy-duty truck. It was insanely powerful, essential for a select few, but ultimately destined to become a niche product in a world that was suddenly obsessed with mobile devices. Moving right along to Section 2, the cylindrical disaster. So after years of basically neglecting their pro users and following the passing of Steve Jobs, Apple desperately needed to prove to the world, and to some very anxious professionals, that they could still build groundbreaking computers. To silence the critics, Apple's marketing chief, Phil Schiller, took the stage to unveil the 2013 Mac Pro. And boy, was it something. It was this glossy black cylinder that was about 1/8 the size of the old Mini Tower. It seriously looked like a prop from a sci-fi movie. As the crowd erupted in applause, Schiller confidently leaned into the mic and dropped this famous line: "Can't innovate anymore? My ass." It was a very direct, arguably pretty arrogant shot at everyone who claimed Apple had lost its edge. Well, as it turned out, that arrogance was a bit misplaced. That cylindrical Mac Pro was arguably the worst one Apple ever made. Its fatal flaw was a totally rigid internal design. The whole machine was built around this unified thermal core, which was perfectly designed to cool two relatively average-powered graphics cards. See, Apple's grand vision was that professional software would evolve to rely on lots of smaller GPUs all working together, but the actual industry reality, it went in the exact opposite direction. The entire industry shifted toward using single, massive, wildly power-hungry GPUs. That tiny little cylinder physically couldn't fit them. And even worse, it had zero internal expansion slots, so you couldn't add your own drives or swap in new cards anyway. Honestly, the result was a catastrophe for pro users. The machines suffered from high failure rates, constant overheating, and a complete inability to be upgraded. Because it was pushed to its absolute physical thermal limit on day one, Apple couldn't even refresh it with newer, hotter chips later on. It literally became a computer frozen in time. Fast forward 4 years to 2017, and the situation was so bad that Apple held a highly unusual, off-script meeting with tech journalists. During that meeting, software chief Craig Federighi made a remarkably rare public admission of failure, saying, "I think we designed ourselves into a bit of a thermal corner." Apple actually had to apologize and admit they needed to go back to the drawing board to totally rethink the Mac Pro.
All right, that takes us to section 3, a triumphant return.
It definitely took them a few years, but in 2019, Apple finally delivered exactly what professional users had been begging for all along. They ditched the trash can cylinder completely and returned to the beloved modular mini tower. But they didn't just step backwards. They genuinely innovated on the classic tower design. They created something called the MPX module system. Now, on a standard PC, when you slot in a heavy-duty graphics card, the video signal can only come out of the ports directly attached to that specific card. But Apple engineered this genius special connector that piped that high-end video signal right back into the computer's main motherboard. That meant every single Thunderbolt port on the back of the machine could output that powerful video signal. No more incredibly messy cables. Plus, Apple utilized the Mac Pro's massive internal fans to passively cool these modules, which kept the whole system astonishingly quiet under heavy loads. And guys, the raw specs on this thing were just bonkers. The 2019 models supported up to 1.5 terabytes of RAM. Let that sink in. Not gigabytes, terabytes. It offered up to a 28-core Intel processor, and most importantly, it brought back 8 user-accessible PCIe expansion slots. It was finally a true modular workstation again. Now, it was also wildly expensive, starting at $6,000. And yes, this is the computer that famously or infamously offered a set of 4 optional little metal wheels for $400. But for that elite top tier of video editors, scientists, and audio engineers, the price wasn't really the object. Capability was. And this machine finally brought the capability back. But our story doesn't end there. Section 4. Killed by Apple Silicon. Here is the ultimate irony of this whole situation. Literally right after Apple spent years apologizing and finally perfected that modular Intel Mac Pro in 2019, they announced just 1 year later that they were transitioning their entire computer lineup away from Intel and onto their own custom-built Apple Silicon chips. When Apple Silicon finally hit the Pro market with the Mac Studio in 2022, it completely blew up the natural order of things. This compact little block of a computer, powered by the M1 Ultra chip, totally cannibalized its massive predecessor. Look at the numbers. The Studio was $4,000 cheaper, yet it was somehow 40 to 75% faster, and it came with double the base storage out of the box. The only remaining advantage the giant Mac Pro tower still had were those internal expansion slots. Everything else was being absolutely dominated by a computer a fraction of its size. So Apple's in a real bind here. How do you build a new Mac Pro that justifies its own existence? Well, their original plan was to create a monstrous, unheard-of chip called the M2 Extreme, which was essentially going to be 4 of their top-tier chips seamlessly fused together. But they hit a massive economic wall. Because these chips were so physically huge, they could only fit 30 of them onto a single $20,000 silicon wafer. And because it required fusing 4 complex dies together perfectly, the failure rate on the manufacturing line was astronomically high. Producing this chip would have pushed the starting price of a new Mac Pro to somewhere around $10,000 just for the base model. It was just way too expensive to realistically manufacture. Which leads us to the final kind of tragic reality for this machine. Apple did end up releasing a 2023 Mac Pro, but because the Extreme chip got scrapped, they just took the exact same M2 Ultra chip from the Mac Studio and slapped it inside the giant tower. The result? It cost $3,000 more, and it offered literally zero extra processing performance. You were exclusively paying $3,000 just to get some PCIe slots. But here is the real kicker. Apple Silicon uses a unified memory architecture. The CPU, the GPU, and the RAM are all permanently baked into one single chip. That means you couldn't plug in extra graphics cards or snap in more RAM later on anyway. The very thing that defined the Mac Pro historically, internal modularity, was physically impossible with Apple's new, highly efficient silicon. The machine was, well, fundamentally pointless.
And that really brings us full circle to a pretty big question I want to leave you with today. With Apple Silicon, computers are basically just like mobile devices now. If you want more storage or more RAM, you have to buy it on day one at Apple's premium prices. You can't just open the side door and snap in a new, cheaper part 3 years down the line to future-proof your investment. Now, we absolutely gained phenomenal speed, mind-blowing efficiency, and really amazing compact designs. But we lost the era of the deeply upgradable, user-accessible workstation forever. Think about how you use your machines right now. Was losing the ability to truly own and organically upgrade our hardware worth the modern computing miracles we got in return? It's a massive trade-off that completely redefined an industry and ultimately left the mighty Mac Pro behind in the history books.